Thanks for being here today.
Excellent. Thanks, Neil. I appreciate it. And thank you, Marion, for setting the right context for what I'm going to talk about. So for all you who have not had enough excitement in your lives, I'm going to discuss some of the details behind the proposed harmonization of ISO of 21 CFR 820 with ISO 1345. Now, I was going to start out with a quick Zoom poll. Unfortunately, that is not working, so I'm going to kind of punt on that, and we will move forward. So I was going to spend a little more time on harmonization background, getting into the history of ISO and 1345 and 820, but I kind of left that to Marion because there is a lot to cover in some of the similarities and differences. But I do want to start with one kind of background slide about why harmonize. And there's been a lot of talk about harmonization. And in fact, one of the things that I was going to talk about was, almost as soon as 820 in 1997 and 1345 in 1996, I think it was, were put in place, there was discussions about harmonization. Because they had kind of come out at the same time, there were similar frameworks. 820 was based on kind of ISO 9001, 2014, or 2004, I think, or wait, 1994. So there was a discussion early on. So what is really the driver behind this? I think FDA's view is basically that collaboration and cooperation with ex-US regulatory agencies is certainly one of their primary goals to help medical device manufacturers have a more globally harmonized QMS. Marion talked about, referenced FDA's communication that to reduce compliance and record-keeping burdens on device manufacturers and modernize the regulation. However, I think it's notable that nothing in FDA's stated intent or rationale point to either A, an improvement of resulting product quality for patients and customers, or B, other benefit for public health, which is its primary mission. So I think that's an interesting comment, and some of the things I may talk later about a couple of differences, I keep that in mind. Also, though, I've tried to look to other sources on why harmonize from FDA's view. I looked to some of the recent writings and quotes from Kim Troutman, who was the lead author for FDA for the original quality system regulation, now in private industry as a consultant. And after the announcement of the harmonization, she had made some comments to MedTech Insight that may provide, and I don't want to speak for her, but may provide some insight from an FDA perspective as to what the agency's concerns are. Kim said that CAPA in one area is one area that she would definitely benefit from a revamp. She would love to do away with the term CAPA. It's so misused and abused. Now, from my personal perspective, she's absolutely right. A lot of people don't like CAPA in industry. It creates a big challenge. It's something I've worked on a lot with companies. And Cisco's presentation about the Keep CAPA Cool, I think, is a reflection of that. Kim also said that 1345 does a much better job of getting into measuring and analysis and talking about how to measure and analyze. Also, risk management. She makes mention of the fact that risk management is, as she said, riddled throughout 1345, but only really once in 820 with respect to design validation. Now, ISO 1345 mentions risk management 5 times substantively, including the definitions. And finally, Kim identifies 1345's lack of the audit and management review exception from FDA investigator view as a positive. In other words, now, she's stating that in the 820 180C, there is an exception that carves out management review documentation and audit documentation from inspection purview during inspection. I tend to agree with her that it's something that's kind of archaic, so that may be some additional indication. But what about industry's view? Well, I think really industry is looking at this from a financial incentive perspective. There is, I think, a perception that there is reduced complexity for multi-market manufacturers due to alignment, reduced time to market from aligned design standards and requirements. I think an increased ability to reconfigure global supply chain due to better aligned design, development, and production standards. Reduced regulatory enforcement rigor. Now, this isn't something that's talked about a lot, But I do think there is a perception and possibly reality that the ISO certainly notified bodies and assessments tend to be less rigorous than FDA. I've certainly told my clients over the years that an ISO assessment is not something you should count on relative to an FDA inspection. So I think there may be some interest there in kind of a reduced enforcement rigor. And finally, some alignment to the MDSAP inspection harmonization efforts. So I think that's where industry is really thinking that this is a benefit and a reason to go through harmonization. So let's look at some similarities and differences. And we've all heard the old saying that the devil is in the details. And I think that's more true than anything with respect to the harmonization of 1345 and 820. Now, it's commonly said by FDA and industry that the requirements between 1345 and 820 are already 95% harmonized. You know, my question in that is that if they are 95% harmonized, where is the burning platform for harmonization? Because that's pretty close. And is it worth the 5% effort to get to a 5% differential? However, if you're talking about harmonizing the top-level structure, broad coverage, lack of detail, I agree. But once you look at the detail, I'd argue that figure is not accurate. I think we'll see a little bit of that later. Also, as Marion indicated, ISO 1345 does not cover 803 MDRs, corrections and removals, or device tracking UDI. Therefore, any coverage and inspection readiness for U.S. law and requirements will still have to have unique U.S. law elements. Also, one area in particular that I may mention later is production and process controls. I've taken a look at this in detail in 820 and in 1345, and in my opinion, and I'd encourage you to look at this, the requirements of 1345 are just light on production and process controls. From an overall review of the standard 1345 versus 820, it's really more of what I would consider a business process quality standard as opposed to a product manufacturing build control model. Now, relative to design controls, I'd say they are highly comparable, at least relative to concepts, terminology, and level of detail, but not production and process controls. So I was asked to get into the nuts and bolts of the standard versus the rule, and although I'd love to, with respect to the entirety of the rules, there's no way I'm going to be able to cover them both. So I picked a couple of areas to take a look at in detail to see whether or not there is similarity or differences and what those look like. So the first example is management review. Basically, this is part of top-level management responsibility requirements in both 1345 and in 820. When you look at the section on management review in 820.20c, it basically says the following: do the review, do it at defined intervals with sufficient frequency, as long as the frequency is sufficient to satisfy this part, 820, and the company's quality policy. Oh, and by the way, dates and results of review shall be documented. Now, this is pretty broad and not very helpful, and in my mind, it's probably one of those sections that vex a lot of quality executives and auditors and possibly investigators. Now, when you look at 1345, it starts off pretty similar. The general part, 5.6.1, somewhat mirrors all of 820.20c. It says the organization shall document procedures, review planned interviews, intervals, include assessing improvement needed changes, and records shall be maintained. However, in 1345, once we get past these generalities, 13485 adds two completely new sections: review inputs and review outputs. The input part, not surprisingly, specifies the minimum necessary inputs, and the outputs specify the outputs. Now, these are not found in 820. So there's one, something that is, seemingly similar, does have a lot of differences. I have to state here that this is copyright ISO. I'm asserting fair use for this educational forum. I'll talk about copyright at the end of the session. So now let's take a look at the next example, device master record. And device master record is what it's called in 820.181 in the QSR. It's called the medical device file in 1345 at 4.2.3. Now, I picked this example because another consultant commentator in a comparison document that's been published online indicated that there were no significant differences in requirements between 1345 and 820. So let's take a look and see what you think. So on its face, the provision from both documents looks similar, right? From a cursory reading, the two sections seem a lot alike. But I think there are some not so insignificant differences. So in the first section of 1345, which is really the scope section, it uses the language, quote, for each medical device type or medical device family. Now, in 820.181, it states there shall be a device master record for each type of device. Now, literally the implication of that is, in my mind, from plain read, is that 820.181 requires a DMR for all device configurations, not just at a product family level. Now, does this matter? Well, I would argue that it matters. If it does matter at all, it matters with respect to harmonization. Because if we can interpret around it, again, I would say why the kind of the burning platform to harmonize. Looking further, though, at the contents required to be kept in the files, we again find differences. So in 1345, it includes the phrase "include but not limited to" when referring to what's required, while 820 uses the term "the following implications." Here, the 1345 language creates ambiguity by not leaving it as a defined set of information. The 820 language kind of tells you what you need. Next, 1345 requires specifications for product to be in the file, where 820 says specifications including appropriate drawings, composition, formulation, component specifications, and software specifications. Now, in my opinion, there's a whole lot of difference here. Here, 820 is again much more specific, and I would argue that the 820 specific requirements are absolutely necessary for DMR. Specifications alone, if that's what I would consider a normal definition of that term, in my mind isn't enough. Then finally, in this section, 1345 requires specifications or procedures for manufacturing, and then talks about packaging, storage, etc. Specific with respect to the operation type, but not what in each of those operations. 820, though, refers to production process specifications, including the appropriate equipment specifications, production methods, production procedures, and production environment specifications. So let's look at a couple more differences. I guess first, in 1345, section 7.5.2 addresses cleanliness of product. And this is essentially in-process contamination control, processing agent removal. There's no analogous section in 820, and the concept is not really at all addressed from what I can see in 820. In 1345, corrective and preventive action, CAPA, our favorite thing, is incorporated into main section 8.5 under improvement. Now, what we know, I believe, is CAPA, or generally what we know is CAPA, principles are addressed in section 8.3, control of non-conforming product. 1345 CAPA does not appear to address non-product related non-conformances. Now, 820 CAPA addresses both non-conforming product and non-conforming processes, such as quality system failures. I think I would argue it's much broader, it appears, than 1345. 820 CAPA also requires a proactive analysis of quality data to identify recurring quality problems. But this is possibly addressed in Section 4 of 1345, but I'm not exactly sure of that intent. And finally, from a difference, and there's a lot more I could have gone into. This is really just a sampling. 1345 requires a quality manual, and there's no requirement for a quality manual in 820. So what are some closing thoughts? I guess first, I think it's arguable that the literal text of 1345 is not harmonized with 820, simply looking at the examples I reviewed. When you consider the overall structure of both documents, the implicit and explicit references and definitions, and the actual text, I think it's just crazy to assert that the documents, much less the concepts, are 95% harmonized. Now, Marion talked about this too, and I think this is a really important point. The literal interpretation of the standard and regulation is just the starting point. The real complexity here is the interpretation and application of the principles and concepts by each company to their individual operations and individual products, which also have individual risk profiles, but then more importantly, or as importantly, how the regulators interpret that meaning under their own regulatory framework. I've always referred to this as what I call the enforcement clouds. Now, will MDSAP solve this? I just don't know. What I do know is that when we move forward, it will not be a simple process. And I really wonder if the juice is worth the squeeze on this. Also, I think there's really nothing that stops much closer harmonization from happening without notice and comment rulemaking. FDA could issue a guidance on alignment principles, formal investigator focus documents or policies such as QSIT to guide the inspection technique to look for those things that are good under 1345 that advance public health, but that are arguably within the 820 legal framework. I would argue that this may be a more effective, less costly and long-term, less confusing approach. Finally, the issue of copyright, I think, is significant. The fact that I had to assert fair use of the ISO standard to make a meaningful discussion presentation where the audience could actually look at the portions of the standard for application, in my mind, is a departure of longstanding principles of open government and regulatory transparency. Now, none of this is a shot at ISO nor a let's not change. Quite the contrary. I'm just not sure where the burning platform is, and I think that there are some real big gaps there. And from a patient safety, efficacy, and overall public health perspective, I'm just not, the agency's mission is not to advance the financial interests of the medical device industry. What I do know is there's more than a 5% harmonization effort that's here for sure. So thank you, and now back to Neil.